This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from the United Nations headquarters in New York City, and this is the Russia Folder. Joining me, as he frequently does, is Dr. Tom Graham, one of America's leading experts on the Kremlin, Russia, the former Soviet Union, and the East, now with Kissinger and Associates and teaching at Yale, formerly the point man, the head man in charge of the NSC's Watch Over Russia. Tom, welcome.
Glad to be here.
It's September, and there's a chill in the air. The chill in the air is not only the wind, it's, at least in the minds of people who are friends of ours and activists in Russia, what's being called by some demedvedevization, hard to say in English, and others call it the Putin screwdriver. He's taking the instruments he has and tightening everything up. What do you make of what's going on domestically inside Russia right now in this tightening up?
Well, I'm not really sure it's a tightening up. Certainly it's an effort by the Kremlin to tighten up, but that's different from it actually being a tightening up both politically and socially in Russia. Certainly Putin and the people around him were taken aback by the demonstrations that erupted at the end of last year. Taken aback by the strength of the discontent within Russian society. And despite all the efforts over the past several months to tighten up laws, to raise the penalties for demonstrations, to criminalize slander once again, and so forth, they really haven't effectively dealt with the discontent. Now, you may not get 100,000 people out in the streets of Moscow. You maybe only get 20,000, but there's still hundreds of thousands of people in the offices, in the workforce, in Moscow and outside the country.
I think you hit a key phrase there. In Moscow, in the recent elections, Moscow did not vote for the new man in the Kremlin. And that must be pretty scary to the people in the Kremlin.
No, absolutely, and because these are the people you depend on to run your government, to run your economy. These are professionals. You can't run a modern society without these people in some way, and they're discontented. So while it may serve your purposes visually to get people off the streets, you still have to have these people actively engaged in the economy, in the political process, if you're going to move this country forward, if you're going to modernize, if you're going to sustain Russia over the long run as a major world power.
Let's be very clear, because you and I hear some of these discussions and metaphors of people talking about a revanche, a going backwards, a tightening up, a counter-revolution. We're not going back to the Soviet days, right?
We are a long way from the Soviet days. We're not even going back to the way it was even 5 or 10 years ago. The society has matured over the past generation. You do have the emergence of a genuine political class that is becoming politically active. And this changes what Putin can do, what the elite can do, and still hope to move the country forward in some way that allows them to play a large role in world affairs.
Well, you also have a whole different information flow than what we used to see in the Soviet days or even in the Yeltsin days, because be it reactionary propaganda on Central TV or just the free-for-all that it was in the early 90s, it was still somewhat under the thumb and control and the will of the people in the Kremlin. That's still the case in the mass media television. But the internet, you have all these young people who travel abroad, start their day reading news from abroad, reading news from emigres abroad, and it's a whole different flow of information and a culture of knowledge.
No, absolutely, and the Kremlin can't turn that off. Again, they can't turn that off and succeed. And you're absolutely right, particularly young people have multiple sources of information. They don't pay attention to the old mass media any longer. And the other thing that has been true for the past decade that we tend to overlook is that almost everything of interest in the West is translated into Russian now. You walk into a bookstore in Moscow and you've got the memoirs of all our political actors. Bill Clinton, George Bush memoirs are translated almost immediately and put on sale. Europeans
Do they have your book on sale? Do you,
Yeah,
and are you getting royalties?
Yeah, it's sold out. the 10 copies sold out immediately and never went into a second printing. But the point is, there are massive amounts of information that are contrary to what the Kremlin would necessarily want people to think about what they're doing, what the state of the country is, and people have access to this now.
And in what you and I care deeply about, the relationship between Russia and the United States, despite some of the harsher rhetoric that Putin used because it plays well in the heartland when he's running for re-election, would you join me in the general assessment that there's actually been a good deal accomplished? You've got WTO. Right after our elections, we're probably going to have a vote finally to get rid of Jackson Vanik, and it might even pass. You know, on the other side, you do have this move this week of saying USAID go away because you've been interfering in our elections and into our politics, and I'm afraid that we may see some of that come back onto the Michael McFaul personally as a good target to bash. But generally, this administration has accomplished some significant things with Russia.
No, I think undoubtedly. The start, they've done some things on Iran, Afghanistan that are important. The WTO, I think, is an important step as well. And I agree with you. The Congress will eventually lift the Jackson-Vanik Amendment as far as Russia is concerned. You know, the fundamental problem, though, now is what do these two countries do going forward? And you see exhaustion is not the right word, but a certain fatigue. You talk to people in Moscow, you talk to people in Washington, and you ask the question, so what's the agenda going forward? What are these two countries going to do that benefits each other and maybe has greater benefits for the rest of the world? And you get blank stares. I mean, people really don't know. And the relationship will not be put on a sound basis until there is a much longer range view of how these two countries are going to interact, hopefully cooperate over the long term.
Do you happen personally to believe that Russia's the #1 strategic threat to America these days, as we've been hearing from some politicians?
Yeah, that's a throwback to at least the 1960s and 1970s, I would say. You know, clearly it's not. The world has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. We really are moving into a multipolar situation where there are a number of major powers, Russia being among them, but China, Japan, India, Brazil, Europe, if it could ever get its act together. And it's hard to point to any sort of one country that is a central geopolitical foe. The real problem now is how you're going to structure this new international environment. Where are you going to find a new equilibrium? How are you going to balance among all the competing interests to come to a type of world order that is relatively stable, relatively secure, and allows for the spreading of prosperity from the rich countries to the rest of the world?
It may be that in our bilateral relations between Russia and the United States, it's the third places that we have to look. So what can we do together in Iran? What can we learn jointly from our experiences in Afghanistan, which after all is not far away from Russia? What perhaps you have a philo-Semite in the Kremlin who cares about Israel. And we've had a year of absolute, you know, what was that movie called, The Wasted Weekend? I mean, we've had a whole wasted year. Nothing has happened. And there are reasons that both countries would like to see more stability and a movement towards a more peaceful solution there. Maybe that we can no longer look at, you know, just the ping pong of us and them and us and them and us and them.
Well, I mean, we do have to sit down and have a serious conversation about various parts of the world. This simply hasn't been a relationship that's been about the United States and Russia. I mean, after all, some of the differences historically have grown or have been over third countries. The Balkans in the 1990s, the former Soviet space throughout the Bush administration. Now we see some of that emerging over the Middle East, how we think about that process. But I would agree with you. What we need to do is sit down and talk about these issues and find out whether there is sufficient strategic overlaps in our interest to be able to work together in those areas. I think if we sat down and had a serious discussion, we would find those things out. But that's something that has yet to have been done.
Yeah, we don't have that going on. And finally, on this Tekushi moment, the thing of, well, if we were going to talk about real Tekushi, today's we talk about the broadening of the law on treason in Russia, which is quite chilling because they're moving away from just spying to betrayal of state interests, which could be virtually anything. The idea that USAID is going to be closed in Russia, is this a movement just Putin playing to the home audience, or do they really feel threatened by a bunch of good people being funded by good Americans?
Look, I think it's a little bit of both, if you want to be perfectly honest about it. And there's an issue of Russian pride. This plays in a lot of different ways. One, I think they are absolutely right. Where does USAID work? It doesn't work in Europe. It doesn't work in advanced countries. Why is it working in Russia at this point? What does it provide that Russia couldn't provide on its own if it really wanted to? Certainly there's sufficient money around to do those things. There's sufficient money to be put into a lot of the programs that USAID runs, humanitarian ones, let alone the political ones. So at one level that is correct. Second, if we were perfectly honest, I mean, there is a problem of interference in Russian domestic politics. And I think we need to be sensitive to that. While we think that we're providing money to good individuals who are doing good things in Russia that are important for Russia's future, it's also clear that many of the people we give money to want to see the regime
fail, fold, or
and we would never allow anything like that in our own country.
And you have in somebody you and I both know well, the ambassador Michael McFaul, somebody who in a different incarnation of his career earlier on was an activist working for the spread of democracy and liberal left partnerships in Russia.
No, absolutely. And you know, the fundamental point is that you can't in one voice say that this is a regime with authoritarian tendencies moving in the wrong direction, and we're funding pro-democracy groups, and this is not interference and not directed against the government in power. So this doesn't mean that you give up on those types of developments. I'm actually much more optimistic about the democratic process because of what you see happening in Russian society itself.
Especially in provincial towns, I find, even more than in Peter and Moscow.
Right, and there is a maturing that we've seen over the past decade or more. Greater differentiation in society. People beginning to learn the skills that you need to operate in a more open political system. We tend to focus only on those that are directly politically motivated at this time. People that we've dealt with. Or Moscow-based
people that we like,
and people that we like.
To be frank,
absolutely. But if you look at a lot of in provincial towns, the groups that come together for local purposes, some environmental, some social, some economic, some working with the local authorities, some not. These are really the cells of a genuine civil society. So that has changed. That has grown over the past decade. And the question going forward is, does it reach a threshold where this begins to have a dramatic impact on the way politics is played in Russia at the highest levels?
Well, we're at the point where if the new Russia is a baby, it's grown to be 21 years old. Now, you and I deal with 21-year-olds. They're somewhat adults, but they're not fully formed adults, and they're on their way to other stages in their lives, but they certainly can walk and talk and do all the things that on the outside look like adult behavior. And it may take this newborn creature that's democratic or semi-democratic or once democratic or soon to be again democratic Russia another 20 years to get to a level of maturity.
Well, but the final point is that the Russians will do it themselves in any event. We really have very little influence over how that's going to happen inside Russia. I think that's the lesson of the past 20 years.
I think so too.
Is through all the effort we put in, it moved in directions that we never really considered. It's developed in a way that we hadn't anticipated. It really is a Russian project. And you know, it's sort of strange that you know, we always accuse Putin and his people of not having enough trust in the Russian people, and that's why they've got managed democracy and so forth.
Mangled democracy, you said.
Yeah,
Mangled or managed?
Managed. You know, but by the same token, we never seem to have enough faith and trust in the Russian people to get it right on their own either, and that they always have to have sort of the mentors from the United States and elsewhere to give them the direction and so forth. The Russians are smart people. They're talented. They will figure this out. They will figure out something that works for them, and we will have to live with that.
And they'll do it in their own way.
Absolutely.
We won't be able to define it. But we will be able to watch it, and we'll continue to watch it on the Russian File for Tom Graham and myself, Jonathan Sanders, from ICASNews.com, live and direct at the United Nations.